To the audio commentary supplement for Chapter 12 on COVID-19. Now, I recommend that you listen to the Chapter 12 audio commentary first, but this provides additional information on the pandemic and fits it into the perspective of crisis management, which is the last part of Chapter 12. Let's start with a quick review of crisis management. A crisis refers to a substantial disruption in operations that physically affects an organization, its basic assumptions, or its core activities. So when we talk about crisis management, we're talking about it from the perspective of the organization. Now, a crisis can have all sorts of human effects, negative effects in other respects, but we're talking about a crisis from the standpoint of an organization managing it, dealing with it, preparing for it. Now, we use the term crisis management to refer to the process of planning for and implementing crisis responses. The idea behind crisis management is that you want to eliminate the possibility of any crisis you can, or reduce the probability of a crisis occurring. And if you can't eliminate it or keep it from happening, you want to be in a position where you can manage it appropriately, navigate it, and possibly even benefit from it as we move through it. So with that in mind, let's talk about the COVID-19 crisis. Now, this pandemic is the most prominent widespread crisis in recent history. But it's different for several reasons. It's a health pandemic that affects entire societies, not just firms or industries. Most of the crises we talk about are ones that affect individual companies. Perhaps they affect their suppliers, or maybe even it's something that affects an entire industry, but it doesn't have that engulfing effect to bring in an entire society, and in this case, the entire world. The magnitude of COVID-19 is far beyond what qualifies for the definition of a crisis. Now, we don't have a specific definition of a crisis in terms of what the financial loss would have to be or some other type of metric, but we have a sense for what a crisis should be. COVID-19 goes well beyond that. It's beyond just the sense of getting through something for a few weeks or a few months and then getting to the other side. It's a lot more complicated. COVID-19 also requires government intervention to manage. Now, even if you don't like government getting involved in business affairs, in a situation like COVID-19, because of the health impact, you have some central planning that is required. Now, you can debate how much needs to be involved, but for many firms, government intervention not only restricted their activities, but was required to help keep them moving. Little is known about the virus and the long-term effects until COVID-19 is researched thoroughly by scientists and epidemiologists. Now, progress was made very early on with the discovery of the virus, but it's the kind of thing that won't be fully understood even for several years. And this creates a very difficult scenario, not just for government officials, but for managers and organizations. How do you decide how to deal with a crisis when you're not really sure how it's going to turn out? So how has COVID-19 affected organizations? Well, the coronavirus, or COVID-19, started in China in late 2019, and its first effect was to shut down Chinese firms. You had a lockdown of individuals and limited travel in Wuhan in China, and Western firms began to experience supply chain interruptions. In other words, as things were shipped from China, whether they were finished goods or parts or products or components that were used in other manufacturing enterprises, those products did not arrive in the U.S. So if you were a U.S. retailer that sold canoes and you sold one and it was made in China, then you simply did not have the product once your stock was depleted. Now, firms outside of China were directly affected as the virus spread to their countries, mostly beginning in early 2020. So in many respects, firms in Europe and those in the United States and other parts of the world began to experience some of the same effects that organizations experienced in China. The direct shutdowns, lockdowns, people can't come to work, various health restrictions that affected how they do business. Most industries were affected negatively. Some, like restaurants and hotels, were forced to close or scale back their operations temporarily. So if you think about this from a perspective of a restaurant, how do you operate when the government is essentially telling you you can't operate? How can you profit? Now, for many restaurants in the West, you could continue to provide delivery or takeout service. Some restaurants were in a position to do that. Domino's Pizza, for example, was a restaurant franchise that was built around the notion of delivery. Other restaurants were primarily sit down, had an ambiance, and the whole notion of delivery just didn't make a lot of sense. Hotels were often forced to close or scale back operations, and even if they weren't forced to close, who needs a hotel if you have to stay at home? Now, some industries like airlines and hotels suffered a massive drop in demand. If we go back to the restaurant situation, it really depends on the type of restaurant we're looking at. Most struggled significantly, but some actually did well, like Domino's. But if you look at airlines and hotels, many of them, it was not an issue of consumers that were not allowed or permitted to obtain or purchase their service. But these were situations where people just didn't want the service. Why would you want to fly somewhere during a pandemic when we know that being in an aircraft for 2 or 3 hours for a flight is one of the most contaminated situations you could have from a standpoint of disease and virus transmission? And of course, if you're not flying anywhere, you don't need to stay in a hotel, so demand drops significantly there as well. It is worth noting, though, that some firms performed well as a result of COVID-19. And this is a truism about really anything that seems to be negative in terms of business activity. There's always somebody that seems to be in a position to do well. Consider that online retailers like Amazon were really positioned well to serve customers unable to shop in physical stores. So if you needed to buy something, if the stores were closed, if you were told you couldn't leave your home, well, you can just go online and order it. For that reason, Amazon actually went through several hiring phases early on with the expansion of the virus. Netflix is another example. If you're sitting at home with not much to do, online content, video content is something that you might be interested in obtaining. Now, many Americans who were not Netflix subscribers became subscribers during this period because they were unable or unwilling to leave their homes. Now, the long-term effect of this, are these subscribers retained several years down the road? We'll have to wait and see. But we do see an immediate effect for Netflix in the early months of the virus spreading in the United States. Zoom video communications is another example. Zoom experienced a tenfold increase in demand for its telecommuting, teleconference, and distance ed services because people were working at home. If you can't work in a face-to-face environment, you need to connect with people, and that creates opportunities for firms like Zoom. Now, Zoom experienced some difficulties early on, in part because it was not in a position to deal with all of this massive expansion in demand. Nonetheless, Zoom was really successful, and it really was a boon for the company early on during the pandemic. It is worth closing this conversation, though, with a common sense note, or something we should really think of as common sense, and that is that the long-term effects of this pandemic are really unclear. Even though we look at it as we've seen it develop, we feel like we know how it's going to play out in the months and years ahead. We don't really know that. We're probably going to have to wait several years before we can look back and get a clear view of how this pandemic has ultimately affected organizational life.